and welcome. This is Confronting Caste, an initiative of the King's India Institute at King's College London. I am Srilata Sircar, and I will be hosting a series of conversations to expand engagement with ongoing research on caste as a system of social power. Today we have with us Shilpa Dahake, who is a PhD candidate in Humanities and Social Sciences at the Indian Institute of Science, Education and Research. Welcome, Shilpa.
Hi, thank you so much for having me here.
We are very glad to have you. So, Shilpa, you've been working in Nashik, living and working in Nashik now for a while, and your thesis focuses on the river Godavari and sort of activism around that and other kinds of issues. Do you want to start by introducing the city and its relationship with the river to us?
Yes, so Nashik itself is located in the northwestern state of Maharashtra in India, and it is a tier 2 city which comes after all the metros in the state, like Mumbai, Pune, and now Nagpur as well. But Nashik is developing at a very higher pace because of its vicinity to Mumbai and Pune. And specifically, coming to Godavari and how it is linked and associated with Godavari, it is along Godavari on both its banks. So Nashik essentially grew along Godavari, along both the banks of the river, and it is very close to its origin. The origin of Godavari is about 30 kilometers upstream of Nashik from Trimbakeshwar. So Nashik's entire identity, from being a religious town to having a good agricultural economy as well as industrial growth, is dependent on Godavari. So Godavari is Godavari is making Nashik self-sufficient in a way in every sector. So that's what Nashik and Godavari relationship, which I'm trying to understand how it is playing out over the years.
Right. So the Kumbh Mela is one of the sort of pivotal events in the year that takes place in Nashik. Is it every 12 years that it takes place, the Kumbh Mela?
Yeah, it is every 12 years.
So you were there during the last Kumbh in 2015, and you were doing fieldwork for your research, but also other kinds of activities around the river and people's relationship to the river. So can you tell us a bit about like what motivated you to take up the kinds of activities you did, and b, what did you observe?
The fieldwork which I was doing during the Kumbh Mela of 2015 in Nashik was sort of my pilot research to sort of do a more in-depth fieldwork in the coming following years. I was just exploring what was happening with Godavari in the city, because there was so much gap in public discourse about Godavari and its ecological situation, and how people are adapting or coping with the environmental changes happening to the Godavari in the city. So that was just an exploration period for me to understand the relationship, where and what sits and what is happening where in the city. And interestingly, the 2015 Kumbh Mela happened to be one of the important events in Godavari's history, because it instigated environmental activism in the city. So usually the preparations of Kumbh Mela starts happening at least 3 to 4 years before the Kumbh Mela. So preparation started happening in Nashik around 2012. And at that point of time, Nashik District Collectorate initiated a study of Godavari's ecological makeup and pollution and its current status, basically. So that report came out and said in 2012 that Godavari is unfit for bathing, for ritual bathing, leave aside the drinking use of the water. And this sort of coincided with an incident in the city itself, in the main city itself, where the river state was completely under water hyacinth. Uh, the water was nowhere to be seen. The entire course of the Godavari was underwater hyacinth, and three buffaloes had uh, drowned in that by entangling in the water hyacinth. And for I think 4 to 5 days, the owner of the buffaloes were not able to locate the buffaloes that where they have gone. But the stench of like dead bodies of the buffaloes sort of attracted people's attention towards this, and they were lifted by the cranes from the water hyacinth to remove the buffalo body. So this sort of this visual pollution of Godavari sort of overlapped with the water quality of Godavari as well, to the governmental report as well. So this sort of created a conversation around pollution of Godavari in the city. And since Kumbh Mela was coming, where people will be converging in millions to have to bathe in the river. So where is the water? As also what kind of water is there in the city? So this sort of all happened around the Kumbh Mela of 2015, and till 2015, the kind of mobilization that people was able to achieve was they gathered under a banner of Godavari Gatarikaran Virodhi Manch, which translates to a forum to stop sewage inflow in the river. So they sort of tried to mobilize people, other groups in the city, and also the corporation to stop the sewage inflow in the river. And then, starting from doing demonstration and protest, they went on to do file a PIL at Bombay High Court. And then all these pressures coming from people, the judicial pressure on the corporation in Nashik, forced the governance to take actions to at least make the Kumbh Mela, to at least make Godavari for Kumbh Mela pollution free. Uh, at least it should look like pollution free. That was the main intent of that. And like I could see in 2015 when I was doing my fieldwork, the river was flowing, and one could not see any visible waste or pollution, garbage in the riverscape in that period. Yeah, so Kumbh Mela sort of attracts and situates Godavari's narratives in many ways. Every Kumbh Mela has its own history to it.
So you touched upon something really interesting, which is this coming together of a visual element that can visibly show pollution, and this sort of religious event, and the sort of sentimental connection that people have to it, as well as the buffaloes. So can you talk a little bit about the idea of pollution, as you see it in your thesis and through your fieldwork, and what constitutes pollution, and when does it actually start to matter, and for whom?
Mhm. So basically, like the anthropological literature on pollution goes back to Puritan pollution debate on Mary Douglas's time scholarship. Similarly, like for pollution and pollution in context of rivers is a very slippery concept. If I translate pollution, the material pollution of the river in Marathi, it becomes Gatari current. That what people use currently are using in Nashik to describe pollution of Godavari, because essentially Gatari current essentially means that the river is turning into a sewer, that every kind of waste is going into the river. uh, the Hindi counterpart of it is Pradushan, which is very less often used. It is used, but it is very less often used in Marathi. But Gatarakaran is more relating to what is happening to the river in terms of people letting out their waste into the river. But as you said, as I said, pollution is a very slippery concept in terms of in the river connections. I would go back to the colonial times, around 1930s, when the entire temple entry movement was happening, was initiated by Dr. Ambedkar. The temple entry movement was sort of clubbed together with using of public wells and water tanks as well. The demand of the class caste people were also there to let them use the public wells and water tanks as well. So this happened in Nashik as well. So just to give you a sense of how Godavari Ghat looks like, Godavari Ghat is a 2 kilometer stretch in the center of the city of Nashik, which has steps on both the sides of both the banks, which lead down to the river. And they're not like high rising steps, but they're at the very low level of the riverbed. And during the Peshwas and up until 2003, one could see stepped wells. They were around 17 in number, laid in the Godavari's riverbed. And then development happened, many buildings, many changes came up in the later periods. But there were 17 kunds, as they used to call them. And these 17 kunds had very specific use as well, and that was very caste uh, sort of caste organization of the use of water of the river as well. So in 1930s, when the temple entry movement was happening, the Mahars of Nashik demanded that there were four kunds, the upstream four kunds. They were called Lakshman Kund, Ram Kund, Sita Kund, and Dhanushya Kund. So these four were not allowed by untouchables to use these kunds or not even come near the vicinity of the kunds as well. So Mahars demanded that we want to access the Kund as well as the vicinity of the Kund's area as well. So a court case happened under CPC, which was criminal proceeding code at that point of time, and the magistrate at that point of time sent out a judgment against the Mahar, saying that you cannot use or access the kunds or are not to come close to these kunds. So the judgment was on the basis of the claim of the higher caste, the upper caste, saying that if until come into contact of these kunds, they would become polluted. They would defile the sanctity of these waters as well. So that was happened, and after this court case, these kunds were fenced with barbed wires so that untouchables cannot enter into these kunds. But eventually, this were very dominant at that point of time. But even now, you can see which stretch of water is used by whom, in sense of which class, which caste come to use these entire stretches. So the pollution from being ritually pure and impure starts shifting to material pollution with the colonial time period coming of entire public sanitation, as well as more towards more after post independence period, when the entire debate of river pollution started happening in context with industrialization and urbanization as well. So pollution shifted its meaning. The English term pollution shifted its meaning in the discourse of policy making in India, and the pollution as we use it today sort of got its meaning and its association with environmental pollution around 1950s and 60s, when the Water Pollution Act was in making. Water Pollution Conservation Act was in making. So, pollution, even though we associate pollution with environmental pollution right now, but it is still whose pollution or whom we see as a pollutant is also important. So in case of Nashik, what I have seen is people who live on ghats are the majorly migrants, or who live nearby the riverscape, who not they are there are segregation as well in those terms as well, like there are upper castes, there are high end societies also along the river, and there are slums also along the river. So the high end societies are not seen as polluting the river, whereas the slums are seen as polluting the river, because they are assumed to have certain set planned sewage management in these high societies, whereas slums are seen to have more unhygienic conditions. So even in that sense, whose pollution is targeted under pollution management studies is also important here. And also, this all debate sort of became more uh, unequal in terms of action with the environmentalism happening in Nashik when people started seeing certain kind of pollution happening in the river through visible changes in the river. Uh, then they sort of forced the NMC corporation in Nashik to take action also. So pollution is still, as a concept, it's still very has very variable meanings to it. Even though the scientific understanding tells us what pollution is, even though it doesn't tell us what it is, but it sort of gives us when sort of pollution starts to show in the river in terms of certain changes to it. So I would say it's still a very slippery concept in specifically in our urban context in India as well.
So, like you mentioned, the idea of purity and pollution is so deeply ingrained in the caste psyche, in the conceptualization of caste, that it's quite difficult to separate that sort of conceptualization of pollution from material pollution or environmental pollution. Um, and a large part of your research has to do with the activism around the river, right? So, do you see sort of reflections of this ideas of purity pollution? Um, Ideas of caste that seep into the activism. So how would you characterize the activist ecology, and who are the activists, and what are the governing logics of their activism?
Um, the majority of activist groups in Nashik, I would say, they are first of all educated class of Nashik and coming from upper and middle class of the demographic of Nashik, and a significant number is coming from upper caste. So essentially, not in the ritual sense, the way pollution of purity was considered at previous times, but the lower class are still the targets and seen as something polluting the river. So the caste difference, the class difference also seeps in there. Like for instance, I started doing river walks along the river while I was conducting my research to get a more deeper understanding of people's connection with the river. So while doing these walks, I used to take people from the religious stretch towards uh, the stretches which were not really people don't travel on foot on these stretches. So and in these stretches, they could see sewage seeping uh, in the river through water leakages and everything. But they see that sewage leakage as government's responsibility. Whereas when they see a slum or when they see a migrant settlement, seasonal migrant settlement on the ghats, they see their waste as the people who are living there, their responsibility. Whereas it's everybody has to have their own equal accessibility to all the amenities, which they don't have. So who is a polluter is also coming down to who is seen as an outsider in the city. So the class and caste factor also pictures, and not directly but indirectly in the conversations about who is polluting the river.
Would you say that because of how integral the Godavari and the Kumbh are to the identity of Nashik, it is seen more as the rightful city of Savarnas or the rightful city of Brahmins, uh, as opposed to other caste groups?
Yeah, so but there's also an interesting debate or sort of a tension between who is a original Nasikkar, like who is the original inhabitant. no one could claim that, uh, even though like the at least the old city where the ghats are, where the kumbh happens, it is dominantly Hindu, uh, but with other other political regimes coming in the history, it became diverse. So no one could claim that Nashik was originally uh, an upper caste Hindu, but certain areas are definitely upper caste Hindu in demographics.
You were talking about sewage disposal and this whole idea of gutterikaran, and like where the sewage is coming from and who's producing it and who's considered responsible for it. Um, you also organized a visit to a sewage treatment plant as part of your work around the Godavari. Can you talk a little bit about that and how the sort of observations and conversations you had connect to this idea of purity pollution and the caste hierarchy?
So I did a sewage treatment plant walk around the World Water Day of 2017. The entire idea was to understand how people see wastewater in the city, or and also what their knowledge is about wastewater. So around 100 people turned up for that event. It was an open to all call of that event, which I did it with in collaboration with the one of the Maharashtra Times dailies of Nashik, as well as the SDP department of Nashik also. So people who came in there, their first reaction was, we didn't know that this STP existed in the city, very close to one of the religious spots. People know about the religious spot, but within the few meters of this religious spot, the STP existed. Nobody knew about that, and it's a huge infrastructure of STP. And people who came in for the visit were the educated class of Nashik. Uh, for them, understanding what was happening to their sewage was not important, but how government was handling the sewage was important. So their whole intent was, what was government doing? Like, government collects so much of tax money from the public. So what are they doing with that money in terms of public amenities? So after the visit happened, I did a group discussion with the visitors and the officials as well. So that's how the conversation which was happening there was, pollution of Godavari is known to everybody of like every one of us present here. Like, Godavari is polluted, everybody knows that. But then who is responsible for it? And then the entire conversation was about a sort of a blame game happening, that is government responsible for it, or the people whose waste we are handling is responsible for that pollution. So for people it was more towards, since it was an upper and middle class educated group, they sort of saw the governance inefficiency towards treating the wastewater, and and they were responsible for then the pollution of the Godavari, and not they themselves. Uh, in the It was interesting to see how somebody who is coming from an educated background, upper class background, see these infrastructures. They see as, for them it's a privilege. They see this infrastructure according to their privilege, because since they're paying for it, they sort of have the privilege of using it as well. Uh, Whereas people who actually work within this infrastructure, like the manual scavengers or people who scrape out the drains, or clean the river, manually clean the river from algal bloom or water hyacinth, they interact with infrastructure on everyday basis. But uh, for them, the pollution is something very different. It's their everyday interaction to the river or to the infrastructure is happening, so they become the part of the infrastructure itself. uh, so in this way, the STPs, the invisibility of STP sort of became visible to people through this visit. That was one. But also the idea of pollution, that my waste is polluting the river, was not something which people could come into terms with. It was inefficiency of the governance of not treating that waste was polluting the river, was sort of a idea or the discussion was happening around.
Right. So you spoke about people whose manual labor, physical labor goes into cleaning and maintaining a certain sort of visual aspect of the river. Um, do you see, first of all, like how much do you know about the caste position of people performing this labor? And secondly, do you see any accounting for this kind of work in the activist circles, in the activism, and the sort of the aspirations of the activism? Do you see it being taken into account in the demands that are made?
The manual cleaning of the riverscape in terms of scraping the algal bloom or water hyacinth, or cleaning of the drains and sewage pipes, this became very frequent after the 2015 Kumbh Mela, and with it also, because of the constant judicial pressure because of the PIL, which activists had filed in the Bombay High Court. These activities became frequent, and that too in a very specific stretch of the river, not the entire stretch of the river. It was very specific around the religious stress, because that was something very visible to everybody in the city. And uh, this is not really was not really demanded by people, the activists, but this was something which the corporation sort of did to perform their duties. So there were gaps in the infrastructure in terms of leakages. So to show their acting on their demands, they use manual labor to do the patchwork in the infrastructure. Uh, and so the entire manual labor comes from this manual labor of doing this work was contracted out. So the it was very contract basis, on a contract basis. So people who were coming in were majorly class, for definitely they were coming from lower class, and also lower caste. A significant number was of lower caste. They were coming from the tribal areas in around Nashik, and like I saw people literally neck deep in the river, in the algal bloom in the river, and they were literally scooping the algal bloom with their bare hands, uh, from with a rope. So it also shows uh, how governance sort of see this human labor as just an infrastructure in the entire network, and not just as a human being, because they are not really safeguarded from the ill effects of the pollution of the river. They are sort of literally facing in on their bodies. Their bodies in contact with the pollution. So it shows a gap, but nobody's talking about it. Even in the activism, the activists who demand the conservation of the Godavari, they don't talk about these things. For them, it is that, see, corporation is doing some work. Uh, Even then, they didn't they demand for that, but they see this action of corporation as performing their duties. So there's a lag,
Hmm.
there's a gap in between what is happening and how people perceive that action as well.
Right. Do you think there is an inherent tension between conservationism and conservationist activism and caste justice in this case? And if so, then do you see a way of resolving it?
There's a tension, very inherent tension in conservation and social justice. Um, the friction comes with the friction is arising because of an ontological question. Because whose river or whose nature are we conserving, and for whom? Uh, unless and until there is a knowledge of everybody's positionality or association with nature is made aware, I don't think we can do away with this tension. This tension would anyways be there because there's a set hegemony of knowing certain things, and these knowledges sort of then dictate what conservation should look like and what should be conserved and in what way it should be conserved. So, understandably, we try to know the alternate way, knowledge of realities or nature. We won't be able to, uh, I think, do go away with this tension of conservation and social justice.
Shilpa, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and for sharing your research with us. And I think you're leaving us with some very interesting insights and questions to think about. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much.
You have been listening to Confronting Caste. During the academic year of 2020-2021, we will be releasing fortnightly episodes of this podcast that you can listen to on all major hosting platforms, including SoundCloud. To know more about our panels, seminars, and workshops, visit kcl.ac.uk/KII/events.